Chapter 1. The bakery had been in my family for 3 generations, and I had been running it alone for 2 years, and I needed help. This was not something I admitted easily. I was the kind of person who found a way to manage things rather than asking for help managing them. My mother had been the same way. Her mother before her, it was not stubbornness exactly, or not only stubbornness. It was more that asking for help required acknowledging that what you had was not enough by itself, and I had been taught, by example more than instruction, that you found a way to make what you had enough. But the bakery was 3 generations of my family's effort, and I was running it into the ground by trying to run it alone, and I loved it too much to let pride destroy it. My mother had died 18 months before. She had been ill for a year before that, which meant I had been running the bakery effectively alone for nearly 3 years by the time I put the notice on the door. 3 years of starting at 4 in the morning and finishing in the early afternoon, and then managing the accounts and the ordering and the repairs and everything else a small business required in the hours that remained. 3 years of doing the work of 2 people with the energy of one, and telling myself it was temporary, that I would find a way, that the bakery would be fine. The bakery was not fine. The bread was still good. I would not let the bread suffer. But everything around the bread, the building maintenance and the record keeping and the supply relationships and the small repairs that accumulated when there was no time to address them, all of it had been quietly deteriorating for 3 years, while I focused on keeping the actual product at the standard my mother had held it to. I put the notice on the bakery door on a Tuesday morning in October. I wrote it on a piece of card and taped it to the glass in the early morning before the first customers arrived. Help wanted, early hours, good with bread, honest wage. I stood back and looked at it for a moment. It felt like a surrender of some kind. It also felt necessary. I had learned, over the years, to distinguish between surrenders that were failures and surrenders that were the practical decision that the situation required. This was the second kind. The first morning nobody came. The second morning nobody came. I started to think that 4 in the morning was too early for most people and that I would need to adjust my expectations. On the third morning he came. I heard the knock at the side door while I was in the middle of the first batch. Not the front door where the customers came, but the side door that opened onto the lane, the door that regulars knew about and strangers usually did not. I noted this without stopping what I was doing. Someone who found the side door was either a regular who had heard about the notice, which was possible since the village was small and news traveled through it efficiently, or someone who had observed the bakery carefully enough to know which door was the working entrance. Either way, it was worth answering. He was tall. That was the first thing I registered. Tall and pale-skinned with black hair that was slightly too long and gold eyes that were doing something I recognized immediately. They were reading the space. Moving through the bakery, the way trained eyes moved through an unfamiliar environment, registering exits and layout, and the people in it without appearing to be doing any of those things. I had seen that kind of looking before in soldiers who had come back from things, and in certain kinds of officials who had been trained to be always aware of where they were. He said he had seen the notice. He said he had worked with his hands before and was not afraid of early hours. He said he was new to the village and needed work, and that he was asking for the job directly because he had found that directness saved time. His voice was even, not flat, not without warmth, but controlled in the specific way of someone who had spent a long time managing how they sounded to other people. I noticed this the way I noticed everything, automatically, without deciding to, and I filed it away alongside the gold eyes that were reading the room. I looked at his hands. This was something my mother had taught me. You could tell a great deal about a person from their hands. His were larger than most, and the grip when he held the doorframe was the grip of someone with genuine physical strength that had been developed over years rather than recently. But the skin was too smooth. A man who had worked with his hands for years the way he claimed would have calluses in specific places. He did not have them, or he had had them once and they had softened from disuse. What his hands told me was that he was not what he said he was. What they also told me was that he was strong and capable and would learn quickly because the foundation was there even if it was currently unused. I thought about this for approximately 10 seconds and decided that a man who was not exactly what he said he was, but who clearly needed work and clearly had the physical ability to do it was still more useful to me than no help at all. I told him the job started at 4 the next morning. I told him the wage and the hours and what was expected. He listened with the particular quality of attention of someone who was committing everything said to memory accurately rather than approximately. I noticed this too. I noticed everything. It was simply how I was. He said he would be there. He arrived the next morning at 3:50. I had been awake since 3 and was already beginning the first preparations when I heard the knock at the side door. I opened it and he was standing in the pre-dawn dark in the lane, patient and present, not fidgeting or checking for any sign of impatience, just there. I stepped back and let him in. I found out later that being early was a habit so ingrained that he could not break it regardless of how hard he tried to appear ordinary. Ordinary people did not arrive 10 minutes early to everything. He could not make himself arrive at the exact time. It was one of the small things that did not fit. I was good at noticing the small things that did not fit. Chapter 2. He learned the work faster than anyone I had ever trained. This required some context to appreciate fully. The work of a bakery is not complicated in the way that some work is complicated, where the difficulty is in the abstract and the technical. It is complicated in the way that physical craft is complicated, where the difficulty is in the specific and the tactile. You learn bread through your hands, through thousands of repetitions of kneading and shaping and timing that eventually build a knowledge in the body that cannot be fully explained in words. Most people took months to develop a reliable instinct for dough. They learned the theory quickly enough, but the feel took time. He had the theory from the beginning, and the feel arrived within 3 weeks, which was the fastest I had ever seen it happen in someone starting from scratch. Except that he was not starting from scratch, not quite. The movements were too familiar from the beginning, even the ones that should have been new. He made mistakes that were the mistakes of someone whose hands remembered something that their conscious mind had not recently accessed, not the mistakes of someone encountering bread for the first time. There was a difference, and I knew the difference, and I noted it without saying anything. He was quiet in the mornings in a way that suited the work perfectly. I had always valued the early hours for their quiet. There was a quality to the bakery at 4 in the morning that did not exist at any other time, a specific quality of focus and warmth and the smell of bread beginning that I found deeply restorative regardless of how tired I was. Most assistants could not inhabit that quiet. They filled it with conversation or humming or the restless small noises of someone who needed external input to feel comfortable. He did not fill it. He was simply in it, working, and the quality of his presence in the silence was comfortable rather than awkward. I watched him with the customers. The bakery opened at 7, and the morning regulars came in a predictable sequence, the same people in roughly the same order, the rhythms of the village making their needs and their timing consistent across weeks and months. He learned them faster than the work. By the end of the first week, he knew which customers wanted to chat and which wanted efficient service. He knew who was struggling financially and who was not, and he adjusted his manner to each without making the adjustment obvious or patronizing. He remembered names after one introduction and connected them to preferences and life details with an accuracy that required genuine attention rather than the surface politeness of someone performing interest. He did not talk about himself, not in the suspicious way, not defensively, or with the quality of someone with something to hide exactly, more in the way of someone who had decided that the present was what mattered and that the past was not needed for what he was doing here. When the inevitable questions came from curious regulars, where was he from, what had he done before, what had brought him to Thornmere, he answered briefly with things that were technically true and moved the conversation elsewhere with a skill that was so practiced it was nearly invisible. I noticed it because I was watching closely, and because I had spent years in a bakery learning to read the subtle difference between a person who was private and a person who was managing. He was managing, I was certain of it by the end of the first month. I was less certain what he was managing or why, and I had decided that in the absence of any evidence of harm, I was going to give him the room to manage it. He cared about the bread. This was the thing that most stayed with me across the first weeks. Not cared in the way that a good worker cared about doing their job well, though he had that too. Something more specific than that. A quality of attention to what the bread was, and what it was for that went beyond craft. He handled the finished loaves with a respect that was almost ceremonial. He was particular about waste in a way that I found initially slightly excessive, and then, the more I understood him, increasingly meaningful. When a batch did not come out quite right, he was genuinely bothered, not because of the professional implication, but because it meant that the people who would have eaten it would have something less than what they should have had. Bread as sustenance, bread as the difference between enough and not enough. He understood this from the inside in a way that I had grown up understanding, and that most people who had never been hungry or been responsible for whether others were hungry did not. I thought at first that he had come from poverty, that he knew hunger personally and specifically. I revised this over the weeks as the picture became more complicated. A man who had come from poverty did not move through the world with the particular ease that he had. There was a quality in how he carried himself, in the specific way he occupied space and addressed people, that was not the quality of someone who had grown up with nothing. It was the quality of someone who had grown up with a great deal and had very recently lost most of it. The bread mattered to him because he had been responsible for people and their bread. That was the reading that eventually made sense of all the other things. But it took a long time to arrive at, and in the first weeks I only had the pieces, not the picture. Chapter 3. The village of Thornmere was the kind of place that did not appear on maps that mattered. It was small and agricultural, and existed because the land around it was productive, and the river nearby was useful for the mill and someone had built here centuries ago, and enough people had followed that a community had formed and persisted. It had no particular history that the wider world would care about. It was simply a place where people had been living for a long time, doing the things that people did, growing up and working and dying, and being replaced by people who grew up and worked and died after them. I had been born here. My mother had been born here. Her mother had been born in a village 12 miles away, and had come to Thornmere when she married my grandfather and had stayed because the bakery was here, and the bakery needed managing. And once you had been managing a bakery for long enough, it became difficult to imagine your life without the particular rhythm of it. I had sometimes wondered what it would look like to arrive in Thornmere as a stranger. The village was not unwelcoming, but it was close-knit in the specific way of small communities that had known each other for generations, where relationships had histories that predated the current generation, and that shaped every interaction whether or not anyone acknowledged them out loud. A newcomer had to navigate a social landscape that was established and intricate, and that was not fully legible from the outside. He navigated it extraordinarily well. Not immediately. He was careful about the pace of it. I watched him across the weeks, and I could see him managing the rate at which he appeared to understand the village. He would let people explain things to him that he had clearly already worked out. He would ask questions that framed his knowledge as less complete than it was, giving people the satisfaction of informing him and allowing him to confirm rather than reveal. This was very well done. It was also a skill that required considerable practice to deploy naturally, and the naturalness of his deployment of it was itself informative if you were paying the right kind of attention. The village liked him. This mattered more than it might have. The village had its own logic about newcomers, and its own way of deciding who was acceptable and who was not, and these things were not always rational or fair, but they were real, and they had consequences for whether a person could build a life in Thornmere or whether they remained permanently on the outside of it. He had some quality that disarmed the usual caution. I thought about this and concluded that it was his genuine interest in people. He was not performing interest. He was actually interested. He actually wanted to know what the old farmer at the end of the high street was worried about with the winter coming. He actually cared about the outcome of the situation the miller's family was navigating. People could feel the difference between performed and genuine interest, and the village, which had a finely calibrated sense for exactly this distinction, felt the genuine version in him and responded to it. I watched what ordinary life was doing to him, not immediately, not dramatically, but in the gradual way that change happened when the conditions were right. The quality I had noticed in the first weeks, the specific weight of someone carrying something enormous, eased as the months went on. Not completely, it was still present, but the way he carried it was different, less effortful, as if the daily work of bread and the village and the ordinary rhythm of Thornmere was giving him somewhere to put it down briefly and rest before picking it back up. He started sleeping better. I could tell this from the difference in how he arrived at the bakery across the weeks. The first month he arrived with the specific quality of someone who had not slept enough for a long time, alert in the oversharp way of someone whose rest was not genuinely restorative. Later he arrived more simply present, more rested in the bones, more able to be in the morning without fighting it. He started noticing things. This was the change I found most moving when I thought about it. In the first weeks he noticed threats, exits, strangers, things that might require a response. The trained watchfulness of someone whose awareness had been calibrated for danger for a long time. As the months passed, the watchfulness softened into something else. He started noticing ordinary, beautiful things. The quality of the light on a particular morning, the way the river sounded after the first autumn rain filled it, the shape of the hills to the east that changed color across the seasons. He pointed these things out to me in the mornings, and there was a quality of discovery in it, as if he were encountering the world as something that could simply be appreciated rather than assessed, and finding the discovery unexpectedly rich. I found that I looked forward to what he would notice. He saw things differently from how I saw them. I had lived here my whole life, and the village and the countryside around it had become deeply familiar, so familiar that familiarity had replaced the actual seeing in many cases. He was new to all of it, and his newness gave it back to me in pieces. He would say something about the morning light or the sound the bakery made as the ovens reached temperature, and I would look or listen and find that I had stopped seeing or hearing it and could now see or hear it again through the fact of his noticing. This was a gift I had not expected. I was careful with it. Some things you held carefully because they were delicate and because handling them too firmly might break them. Chapter 4. There is a specific intimacy to working with someone at 4 in the morning that I had never had occasion to examine before he came, because I had never had anyone to work with at 4 in the morning who was worth examining. My previous assistant had been a young woman from the village who had worked in the bakery for 8 months before leaving to get married. She was cheerful and willing and got on with the work without needing to be directed, which were considerable virtues, and she talked constantly, not unpleasantly. She was genuinely pleasant company. But the talking had been about surface things, the village gossip and the weather and what was happening in her life, and the 4 in the morning had been filled with it, and I had not known until it was gone what I had been missing. The particular quality of the early hours that I had always valued in solitude, the specific quiet that allowed a different kind of thinking and a different quality of presence, had been unavailable to me during the 8 months she had worked in the bakery. He gave it back. He was in the mornings the way I was in the mornings, present and focused and comfortable with the quiet as a state rather than a problem to be solved. We worked in the 4 o'clock silence, and the silence was full rather than empty, and I found it deeply satisfying in a way I had not anticipated when I put the notice on the door. The guards were down at 4 in the morning, not absent. He was too practiced at managing himself for them to be absent entirely, but thinner. The carefully simplified version of himself that he presented to the village and to the customers was less complete at that hour, and what showed through the thinness was more interesting and also more sad than the surface version. He told me things at 4 in the morning that he did not tell me at other times. I want to be accurate about this. He did not tell me large things. He did not give me information that would have explained who he was or where he had come from. What he gave me were fragments, small pieces that were real and specific, and that came out of the work or the quiet, or whatever it was about that hour that made the managed version of him less complete. He told me about a harvest festival he had attended as a child in which the abundance of the season had been so great that the celebration had lasted 3 days, and the people had simply given food away to anyone who passed, because there was enough and more than enough, and the feeling in the community during those 3 days had been something he had spent years trying to recreate and never quite managed. He told this with a specificity of detail that came from memory rather than story, the smell of particular foods, and the sound of particular music, and the way the light had been at a particular moment of a particular evening, and I listened and noticed all of it and filed it carefully. He told me about learning to read from a woman who had believed, with a conviction that had seemed absolute to him as a child, that the ability to read was a right rather than a privilege, and that anyone who withheld it from anyone else was committing an injustice. He said this woman had been the first person he had truly admired, and that her conviction had shaped how he thought about knowledge and access to it for the rest of his life. He told me this with the specific quality of voice that people used when talking about someone who had made a fundamental difference to them, someone whose influence was so woven into who they were that separating the person from the influence had become impossible. He told me about a city. He described it in pieces across several mornings, never naming it, always approaching it obliquely through specific sensory details. The smell of it in the morning, a particular combination of stone and water and something cooking that was specific to that city and no other. The quality of the light in a certain season, the way it came through the buildings at a specific angle and made the stone look like something lit from the inside. The sound the market made on the day before a particular festival that happened once a year. He described all of this with the specific grief of someone describing a place they had loved and could no longer access, and I understood that wherever the city was, it was not somewhere he could go back to, and the not going back was a significant part of what he was carrying. I turned the fragments over. I was not doing this to expose him. I was doing it because the fragments were real and they were him, and I had found that building an accurate understanding of a person was something I did automatically, the same instinct that ran the bakery and managed the accounts and kept track of which supplier was reliable and which was not. I applied it to people without deciding to. What the fragments added up to was a picture that did not fit in ordinary life. The harvest festival described with the specific quality of someone whose celebration of abundance was not a personal thing, but a collective responsibility. The woman who taught him to read as though literacy were a right which was the kind of conviction held most strongly by people who had the power to make it more than conviction. The city that he loved and could not return to. The particular quality of grief in how he described the city, which was not the grief of exile by choice. I was beginning to understand something. I did not yet know what I was understanding. The picture was forming too slowly, the pieces arriving too far apart for me to see the shape of it yet, but I knew that when I finally saw it, it was going to be larger than I had assumed. I kept making bread, I kept listening, I kept filing everything away with the care I gave things that mattered. Chapter 5. By the 6th month, I was no longer pretending to myself that what I felt was simply professional regard for a competent employee. I had been pretending this for approximately 2 months before I stopped, not to anyone else. I had not told anyone anything, and there was nothing visible between us that anyone observing from outside would have identified as anything more than the easy working relationship of two people who had found a comfortable rhythm. I had been pretending to myself, which was harder and also less useful, because pretending to yourself about what you feel does not make the feeling go away. It only means you carry it with less information than you would have if you had been honest, and less information makes everything harder to manage. So I stopped pretending, and I looked at what was actually there. What was actually there was this. I thought about him outside of the bakery in a way that was disproportionate to any professional explanation. I thought about things he had said and what they meant. I thought about the fragments and what they were adding up to. I thought about the particular quality of the mornings when he was there versus the mornings when he was not there, of which there had been two, both times because of minor illness that he had been transparent about and that had resolved within a day. And I had found both of those mornings significantly worse than the mornings before he arrived, and significantly worse than they should have been if he were simply a useful employee. I thought about the way he looked at me sometimes, not always, not the professional looking of someone attending to their work, the other kind, the kind that was specifically directed at me rather than at the situation I was part of. I had caught it several times across the months, and each time it had been brief and then managed away, and I had noted it and filed it, and had not done anything with it, because the timing had not been right, and because I was a careful person who did not act on things before they were ready to be acted on. The bakery felt different with him in it. I thought about this carefully because it was the kind of thing that could be sentimental rather than real, and I was not interested in sentimentality as an explanation for anything. I tried to identify what specifically was different. The work got done. That was real and practical. The quality of the mornings was different. That was real but harder to quantify. The specific texture of being in the bakery was different when he was in it. The place felt more inhabited. There was a quality of presence that the bakery had when he was there that it did not have when he was not there, and that presence was not just useful, it was good. I had spent 2 years making the bakery work alone. I had been proud of making it work alone. The pride was real. I had done something difficult, and I had done it well, and the doing of it had cost me something, and the cost was part of what made it something to be proud of. I was not willing to minimize what those 2 years had been. But they had also been lonely in a way I had not fully acknowledged while I was in them. I had managed alone, and I had been fine, and fine had been true, but fine had not been everything. There was a version of the bakery that was better than fine, and I had not known that version existed until I was in it. I held all of this, and I thought about what to do with it. The answer I kept arriving at was to continue being careful. He was my employee. He had a past he was not sharing. He was someone who was clearly in the middle of something I did not fully understand, and who had come to Thornmere to be somewhere that did not require him to be whatever he had been before. Complicating his situation with my feelings was not something I was willing to do without considerably more information and considerably more certainty that what I was reading from him was real and not projected. I continued being careful. I also continued noticing everything. The two things were not incompatible. You could be careful and present at the same time. You could wait for the right moment without pretending the moment had not yet arrived. I was good at waiting. The bakery had taught me that timing was most of the skill. Chapter 6. The man came on a Wednesday morning in early spring, 8 months after Cale had first knocked on my side door. I heard the knock at 4:30 while I was working on the second batch of the morning. Cale was at the ovens and I was at the shaping table, and the knock was at the back door, which meant someone who knew the building, and it was too early for customers and too late for deliveries, so I noted the anomaly before I answered it. The man at the door was well dressed in the way that announced money and connection to a world larger than Thornmere. His clothes were city clothes, practical for travel but clearly of good quality, and he had the look of someone who was accustomed to his quality being noted. He had the specific composure of someone who worked for someone important and had absorbed, through proximity to that importance, a quality of authority that was not entirely his own, but that he had learned to deploy effectively. He asked for Kale by a name that was not the name I knew. It was a full name with a title before it, a significant title. I heard the title and my mind did the thing it does when it encounters information that does not fit the existing structure, a kind of halt followed by a rapid silent reorganization of everything that had been assumed. I recognized the title. It was not a title that belonged in my bakery at 4:30 in the morning. It was a title that belonged in a different kind of room entirely. I looked at Kale. He had turned from the ovens when he heard the knock, and he was standing now in the middle of the bakery, with his hands still covered in flour, and his gold eyes doing something I had not seen them do in 8 months of watching them. They had gone still in a specific way that was new. His usual stillness was the stillness of someone controlling what they showed. This was the stillness of someone who had been found and was deciding in real time what happened next. The well-dressed man and Kale exchanged a few sentences that I did not fully follow, partly because they were spoken quietly, and partly because my mind was still processing what the title meant and what it meant that Kale had answered to it. What I caught from their exchange was that something had changed in a situation that had apparently been ongoing, and that Kale's presence somewhere was being requested. Kale listened with the specific quality of attention I had watched him bring to everything that mattered, complete and efficient, and at the end of it, he said something brief that the man accepted without argument. The man left, I watched him go, and then I looked at Kale. The bakery was warm, the ovens were at temperature, the bread was progressing as it always progressed. Outside the window, the village lane was dark and still at 4:30 in the morning, and the particular quiet of the early hours that I had always valued was present and completely different from any other morning. He looked at me, his gold eyes were doing the thing they did when they were fully present and not managing anything, the thing I had been watching for 8 months. He said my name. He said it in the way of someone who is about to say something significant and is acknowledging that the person they are saying it to matters. He said he needed to explain. He said he was sorry for the timing, which he clearly was, and that he would explain everything if I could give him the morning. I said, all right. I said it in the specific voice I used when I was managing a situation without yet having enough information to understand it. I had used that voice many times in the bakery, with difficult suppliers, and with customers who were distressed, and with the various unexpected situations that arose when you were running a small business for years. I had never used it in quite this context before. He told me. He gave it to me carefully, in the right order, with the context that made each piece comprehensible before he gave the next piece. He had been a king, not metaphorically, an actual king of an actual kingdom. He had been king for 7 years, crowned at 26 after his father's death, and he had governed for those 7 years with what I understood from the specifics he gave me was considerable competence and genuine care for the people he was responsible for. A coup had ended it 14 months ago. The coup had been thorough. There was no going back to the throne. He was alive because certain people had ensured his escape, and that was the best that could be said for the situation. He had come to Thornmere because it was as far from the capital as a person could reasonably get while still being in a place where they could sustain themselves. He had needed somewhere that did not know him, somewhere without the weight of being known, somewhere he could simply be a person doing ordinary work without the ordinary work being colored by what he had been. He had seen my notice, and he had needed work, and he had not intended to stay as long as he had. He said the last part with a quality in his voice that told me it meant more than the words. I stood in my bakery in the early morning and looked at him, tall and pale-skinned with black hair and gold eyes that were looking at me with everything in them that he had been managing for 8 months, the flour on his hands, the bakery behind him that he had been maintaining as carefully as I had, more carefully in some ways because he understood from a different angle than I did what bread meant to people and what the loss of it meant. All the fragments arranged themselves into the picture I had been building without knowing what I was building, the harvest and the quality of abundance, the woman who taught him to read because literacy was a right, the city with the particular light that he could not return to, the way he handled the bread, the way he handled the people, the specific ease he had with everyone he met that came from years of being responsible for them. The picture was large. I had been right about that. I asked him to give me the morning to think. He said, of course. I told him I needed him to finish the batch first because the bread still needed making. He almost smiled at this, almost, and he turned back to the ovens and finished the batch, and I went back to the shaping table, and we finished the morning work in a silence that was different from every other silence the bakery had contained. Chapter 7. I sent him home after the morning work was done, not with coldness. I told him I needed the afternoon, and he nodded and he left, and I locked the bakery door, and I sat down at the back table and I thought. I thought for a long time. I was not going to rush this. I had learned across the years that the conclusions you arrived at when you rushed were usually the conclusions you wanted to arrive at rather than the ones that were accurate, and I had no interest in a comfortable conclusion. I wanted an accurate one. Here was what I knew, stripped of everything except the facts. He had come to work in my bakery under a name that was not false but was incomplete. He had worked in my bakery for 8 months without telling me that he was a person of significant consequence who was living in hiding. He had built a relationship with me, professional, and then something more than professional, while withholding the most fundamental information about himself. The question was not whether this was a deception. It was. The question was what kind of deception it was, and whether the kind mattered to what I did next. I thought about his reasons, not the reasons he had given me, though those were real, but the reasons that were underneath the reasons. He had needed to disappear. A man who had been a king could not become an ordinary bakery assistant in a village if he announced himself as a former king. The announcement would have changed everything immediately. I would not have hired a king to make bread at 4 in the morning. I might have been afraid. I might have been confused about what it meant and what it required. The village might have reacted in any number of ways, most of them unhelpful to his need to be somewhere quiet and unknown. He had not lied to me. I reviewed this carefully. He had not told me untrue things. He had told me things that were true, and that created an impression that was incomplete. The incompleteness was the deception, not the content. This was a meaningful distinction, not a full exoneration, but a meaningful distinction. What was actually difficult was not the king part. I found the king part less difficult than I expected, perhaps because the king part explained so much that had been unexplained. The fragments arranged themselves, the competence with people, the quality of his attention, the way he cared about the bread, the specific kind of weight he had been carrying. The king part was information that made 8 months of accumulated observation suddenly coherent in a way it had not been before. What was difficult was the 8 months. 8 months of building something, of the 4 in the morning and the conversations and the way the bakery had changed and the way I had changed, and all of it built on a foundation that had a significant piece missing. I had been trusting him with things, telling him things, feeling things in his presence, and he had known something about himself that I had not known, and that had been relevant to all of it. I sat with this for a long time. I tried to look at it from his position. He had come to Thornmere needing the ordinary life. He had found it. At what point in the 8 months had he understood that the ordinary life had become something more than he had intended? At what point had telling me become something he was going to have to do rather than something he might eventually choose to do? Had the weight I had seen easing been partly the weight of knowing that the longer he waited the harder it would be? I thought it had. I thought the last months of his time in Thornmere had been complicated by this in ways I had attributed to other causes. By the time the afternoon light changed, I had arrived at what I needed to arrive at, not resolution, understanding. I understood what had happened and why and what it cost him and what it meant. I did not yet know what I was going to do about it, but I knew that what I was going to do about it was not going to be simple and was not going to be decided in one afternoon. I wrote a message and sent it to his lodgings with the baker's boy who ran errands for me. The message said to come back tomorrow morning. It said the bread needed making, and the bakery needed 2 people, and the conversation could wait until after the morning work was done. I sent this message because I had always dealt with difficult things by working through them, and because the bread genuinely needed making, and because I was not going to make a decision about something this large until I had been in the same space as him again and seen with my own eyes what 8 months of him were in the context of what I now knew. Chapter 8. He was there at 3:50. He was always there at 3:50. Some habits could not be broken regardless of everything else. I let him in. We began the morning work. The first hour was quiet with things in it, not the comfortable quiet of the previous 8 months, a different quiet, the kind that had weight and direction and that both of us were navigating carefully. He did not push the conversation toward what needed to be said. He worked with the same competence and care that he always brought to the work, and the care felt different now that I understood it, felt larger and sadder and more real all at once. The bread was bread. He cared about it the same way he had always cared about it. The caring had not been a performance. That was clear in the 4 in the morning quiet where performance is thinned out. I asked him about the well-dressed man. I asked what he had wanted and what it meant and what was happening beyond what I had been told. He told me. There were people working toward a restoration of some kind, not a full restoration of the throne, that was not possible but something. A restructuring of the current power that would reduce the harm being done to people who were suffering under it. They needed him involved. His absence had been necessary, but it had become a liability to people he cared about. The time had come to make a decision. I asked him what the decision involved. He said returning to the capital, not permanently, not to resume a public role as he had previously had it, to do a specific thing that was needed and that only he could do, and then to see what shape things took afterward. I asked if afterward included a possibility of coming back. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had negotiated the terms of his involvement carefully. He said he had been careful about the terms for a specific reason. He said that he had found something in Thornmere that he had not expected to find, and that was not willing to simply leave, and that the terms of what he was agreeing to had to account for the fact that there was something here worth coming back to. He said my name. He said it in the way he said it when it was carrying more than just itself. I kept my hands in the dough I was working. I felt the texture of it under my palms, the specific give and resistance that told me it was right, and I thought about 8 months and what I had understood in them, and whether what I had understood was the person or the version of the person. I asked him the question that mattered most. I asked whether the version of him I had been working with for 8 months was him, not the king, not the exiled man performing ordinary. Him, whether the 4 in the morning version, the one that told me about the harvest, and the woman who believed in literacy and the city with the particular light, whether that version was the actual person or whether it was another performance. He stopped what he was doing. He looked at me. His gold eyes in the 4 in the morning light were very direct and not managing anything. He said it was the most him he had been in 7 years. He said it carefully, with the specific weight of someone who had thought about this and knew what they were saying. He said the king had been him too, that he was not disowning that version, but the king was a version that had been required to be only what the role required. The bakery had given him back parts of himself that the role had made unavailable. The 4 in the morning and the bread and the village and the specific version of himself that he had been in Thornmere was not a performance of ordinary. It was the actual version. It was what remained when everything else had been taken away. I worked the dough for a moment. I felt what I was feeling, and I did not push it away or manage it. Then I told him something. I told him that what I had understood about him in 8 months was real, not the king, the person who cared about the bread and the people who ate it, the person who noticed things at 4 in the morning that I had stopped noticing, the person who gave me room without being asked to and who listened with his full attention and who had made the bakery something different and better than it had been before he arrived. I told him that what I felt was real. I said it simply because it was a simple thing, even if the situation around it was not. He looked at me for a long time. Then he told me what he had felt. He told me when he had understood that what he was doing in Thornmere had stopped being about the ordinary life and had become about a specific person within the ordinary life. He said it had been gradual and then suddenly clear, the way things often were. He said it had been the most complicated thing about the decision he had to make. He said it was the reason the terms had been negotiated carefully. The bread was ready. The village would be waking soon. We looked at each other in the warm bakery in the 4 in the morning light. That was enough for that morning. Some things needed to settle before the next thing. Chapter 9. He took 3 days to make the final decision. He had told me the terms were being negotiated, and the negotiation was still in process, and he needed the 3 days to ensure that what he agreed to was precisely what he could deliver and no more. I understood this. A man who had been responsible for large things understood the importance of agreeing only to what you could be certain of. I ran the bakery alone for those 3 days. It was not difficult in the practical sense. I had run it alone for 2 years. The muscle memory was there, but it was quieter than I wanted it to be, and the mornings had a quality they had not had since the first days after he arrived, a quality of incompleteness that I now recognized for what it was. On the 4th morning, he arrived at 3:50, and I let him in and we began the work. And after the first batch was in the oven, he told me what he had decided. He was going back. The decision had been made, and the terms were what he had negotiated them to be. He described what he was agreeing to in the specific and precise way he described everything that mattered. It was not a restoration of the throne, and it was not a permanent return to the capital. It was a specific intervention in a specific situation that would take approximately 4 months, and that would address a harm that was ongoing, and that he was one of the few people positioned to address. At the end of 4 months, he would have completed what was being asked of him, and the rest would be negotiated in the light of what had happened. He said he had been careful about the rest. He said the rest included coming back. He said this in the specific way. He said things that he had thought about carefully and that he meant without qualification. I listened to all of it. I asked the questions I had. He answered them with the same directness he had always brought to things that mattered. When I had asked everything I needed to ask, I was quiet for a moment, and then I told him what I needed to tell him. I said that I understood what he was going to do and why he was going to do it. I said I was not asking him to not do it. A man who had been responsible for people and who had the ability to reduce harm to those people and who chose not to because it was inconvenient was not the person I had understood him to be across 8 months, and the person I had understood him to be across 8 months was exactly who I was in this with. I was not asking him to be less than that. I said I was asking for one thing. I said I was asking him to come back when he said he would. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said he would. He said it simply and with the particular quality of his voice when he was saying something he had thought about completely and meant without reservation. I believed him not because I was naive, because I had 8 months of evidence that was consistent, and because I had read him carefully for 8 months and I trusted my reading. He did not say things he did not mean. He withheld things. He managed his disclosure carefully, but what he said he meant. We had 3 more weeks. They were different from the weeks before. The bakery was the same bakery, and the work was the same work, but we were in it differently, knowing what we were and what was coming and choosing to be fully in the 3 weeks rather than in what came after. There was a quality to those 3 weeks that I thought about many times afterward. The specific intensity of time is finite. The way ordinary things became significant because you were counting them. The morning he left, I walked with him to the end of the village. The morning was gray and cold, with the specific cold of early spring before the warmth had decided to arrive. We said things that I will not put here because they were ours. At the end of the lane, he turned and looked at me, and I looked at him, and then he was gone, and I walked back to the bakery. I went inside. I lit the ovens. I began the morning bread. The village needed bread, and the bread needed making, and I was very good at waiting for things that were worth waiting for. I knew he was worth waiting for. 8 months of the most careful attention I had given to any person in my adult life had told me that clearly, and I was going to trust what I knew. Chapter 10. He was gone for 4 months and 2 weeks. He had said approximately 4 months, and it was 4 months and 2 weeks, and I had not been counting, except in the way that you count things by knowing exactly how long it has been without writing it down. I ran the bakery. I hired a new assistant, a young woman from the village who was quick to learn and good with the customers, and who asked me once in the 3rd month why I smiled sometimes when I looked at the front door in the mornings, and I told her I was thinking about bread, which was not entirely a lie, because I was always thinking about bread. He sent 3 letters. The first arrived 6 weeks after he left and was careful and brief, the kind of letter that could not say the things it was actually about, but that said enough. The second arrived at 2 months and was longer and said more. The third arrived at 3.5 months and was the longest of the 3, and I read it twice and kept it in the drawer with the accounts. He came back on a Tuesday afternoon in autumn. Not at 3:50, not at the back door. In the afternoon, when the bakery was closed and the front door was locked, and I was doing the accounts at the back table with the specific focused attention that the accounts always required, and that I was not actually giving them on that particular afternoon because I had been finding the accounts difficult to concentrate on for several weeks. I heard the front door. There was a specific quality to how he knocked that I recognized before I had consciously identified it, a specific rhythm that was his, and I put down my pen and I went through to the front of the bakery. He was standing in the doorway with the autumn light behind him. He looked different and exactly the same simultaneously. Different in the way that someone looked different when they had been through something that cost them something real. The same in the way that the essential thing about a person was not changed by the things that cost them. His gold eyes found me immediately, and they were doing the thing they did when they were not managing anything. I stood in my bakery and I looked at him, and I felt what I felt without managing it, and I thought about 4 months, and the letters and the autumn mornings I had been running with the assistant who asked me about doors, and I thought about 8 months before that, and all of it was present at once. He came in, I locked the door behind him. I went to the kitchen and I made food because he had been traveling and people who had been traveling needed food, and he followed me and sat at the kitchen table, and I cooked and he talked and I listened, and the kitchen was warm and the afternoon light was the golden autumn kind, and all the things that needed to have been said had been said or were being said, and the rest of it was simply present, simply real, simply ours. He told me about the 4 months, what he had gone to do and what it had involved and what the outcome had been and what it had cost. He told me carefully, with the same specificity and honesty that he brought to everything that mattered, and I listened with the full attention I had given him since the first morning and that I would keep giving him. I told him about the 4 months here. The assistant and the autumn bread and the letters and the accounts I had been unable to concentrate on, and the specific customer who had asked about him every single week without fail, and who had been visibly relieved when I told her he was coming back. When the food was gone and the afternoon had moved into evening, he said something. He said he had thought about this kitchen every day for 4 months. He said this with the specific quality of his voice at its most honest, the 4 in the morning quality, the version that did not manage what it sounded like. He said not abstractly, specifically, the particular warmth and light of it and the person who was in it. I looked at him across the kitchen table, pale skin and black hair and gold eyes that were warm and present and not performing anything. I told him I was glad he was back. He reached across the table. He took my hand in his. His hand was warm in the specific way of someone who worked with ovens and who had the warmth in their skin from years of it, and I held it, and the kitchen was exactly the right temperature, and the autumn was outside, and we were inside, and everything that had been working toward this was simply here now, simply present, simply real. The bakery needed managing in the morning. There was bread to make, and a village to feed and accounts to finish, and all the ordinary work of a life that was continuing. None of it was less real for what had happened and what had arrived. All of it was better. Epilogue. 1 year after he came back, the bakery opens at 4 in the morning, and there are two of us again, and the two of us is different from any other two there has ever been. He is not the assistant. That arrangement dissolved in the natural way of things that have been superseded by a different reality. The bakery is ours in the way that things become ours when two people have been building them together long enough that the seam between yours and mine has closed over and become invisible. He handles certain things and I handle certain things, and we handle the rest together, and the arrangement is not formal and was not decided upon. It simply became what it was. The village knows him now, not as what he was, or not primarily, though there are people in the village who have worked it out by now, and who have kept it with the particular discretion of small communities that protect the people within them. What the village knows him as primarily is the person who works in the bakery and who knows everyone's name and who fixes things without being asked, and who has been here for nearly 2 years, and who is clearly intended to keep being here. This is who he is here. It is not a diminished version of what he was. It is a different version, and in some respects a more complete one. There are things that take him away sometimes. The situation he went back to address did not resolve cleanly in 4 months because nothing like that ever resolved cleanly. There are threads still being worked through. There are times when the well-dressed man or someone like him arrives at my side door and has a quiet conversation with Kale that I am not part of, and after which Kale comes to me and tells me what he can tell me, and we work out together what it requires, and whether it requires him to go and for how long. He comes back every time, when he says he will, and sometimes before he says he will. The coming back has become the most consistent thing I know about him, which is saying something because there are a great many consistent things I know about him after nearly 2 years of the closest attention I have given anything. We are at 4 in the morning. The village is asleep and the lane is dark and the ovens are at temperature and the flour is on both our hands. The morning has the specific quality of itself that it always has at this hour, the warmth and the smell of bread beginning and the particular silence that is not empty but full. He says something, not about the bread and not about anything practical, about the morning and what it contains. He says it in the 4 in the morning voice, the most honest version, the one that does not manage what it sounds like. I answer him the same way, in the same voice, the one that does not manage anything because there is nothing here that needs managing. The bread is almost ready. The village will wake soon. We will open the bakery and the regulars will come and the day will do what the day does. There are accounts to manage and supplies to order and the small repairs that accumulate and all the ordinary work of a life that is fully and genuinely lived. He is here, he chose to be here and he keeps choosing it, and I chose to let him in on the 4th morning when I left the gate open, and I keep choosing it, and the choosing is the thing that makes all the rest of it real. The bread is honest, the morning is real. The rest of it is everything.